some hope to die.
By these 50 countries, differing so much in race and religion, in language and culture.
It is a big idea, a new world order.
Well, I know they're lying. They tricked me once, but they're not going to trick me twice. The time is now. Welcome back to the Professor Penn podcast. This is David Penn, your host. Glad to be with you once again on this Thursday night, July 10th, 7:30 p.m. Central Standard Time. We have a guest in studio this morning. This is part of our ongoing exploration of what's going on here in Minnesota, in the Minnesota Republican Party, and in the Republican Party nationally. Actually, we could even say in the Democrat Party. What I'm working on with you, and what I hope, I'm going to be very definitive about it, I'm trying to understand and explore how faith and religious tradition is part of our politics today, and how that faith interfaces with other subcultures, for example, the military subculture, which is so important in our political life. And to that end, I've invited into the studio today a very interesting character, someone that I know not well, but someone that I've interacted with over several years, a gentleman named George Bakalov. Good morning, George.
Good morning, David.
Thank you for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
I'm excited about talking with you. George has a very interesting history. George was born in a communist country, the country of Bulgaria. And for those of you that don't know it, Bulgarians, Bulgaria at one time was an empire. So Bulgarians actually carry the same kind of confidence and feeling of manifest destiny, should we call it, or empire supremacy that we do here in the United States.
Hey, one of the oldest European empires, that's correct.
And George was born when that great country was part of the Soviet Union's sphere of influence behind the so-called Iron Curtain. So George grew up in a godless Marxist culture. And when he was a young man, he, for reasons he's going to explain to me here, and explain to all of us, discovered Christ and the gospel, and it changed his life, and he became a street preacher and tried to work with his fellow Bulgarian citizens to bring the gospel to them also. And George is going to tell us how he got to the United States. Anyhow, why don't, George, rather than me make it up, why don't you tell me that story? How did you, in that very godless Marxist environment, discover Christ, discover the gospel, and what happened in your life, and where did it take you?
Yeah, thanks, David. I'm now a proud American citizen, and as you know, part of becoming a citizen is to make an allegiance, to vow allegiance to the United States, to the Constitution. This is a big deal to me. I don't take this lightly at all. So having that background, and at the same time, embracing America and what it stands for, and now my children have been born here. I have a grandchild, so, so it's like you're now one with the people. As you know, in the Old Testament, there was like this story of Naomi and basically King David's grandmother, who was a Gentile, and she said, well, your people are my people. Your God is my God. Your people are my people. And that becoming one with someone you're not one with before is very important. That's been my process here. So I do see the world differently, both from my perspective as growing up under communism, as well as from a perspective of understanding Americans' unique place and role in the world. And it being very personal to me too, because it's now my country as well, and my people, and what I defend and appreciate and apologize for in different contexts. Europe, as you know, is a very different and distinct view of the world, and oftentimes I run into interesting conversations with my European friends, right? And I can see how they see America in a outside of the fishbowl, so to say, in a very different way. And vice versa here in the United States, I can see how a lot of my friends really still don't understand Europe and don't understand communism for that matter. Like the communist story has not been told, I don't think, adequately still in schools and colleges. I interact with a lot of people, and they still, like when I mentioned the fact that communism has murdered, communist regimes have murdered over 100 million people. Many people are shocked. They don't really understand how is that even possible? Is that true? And that's a conservative number, mind you. So to slaughter 100 million people in 100-year span is quite a evil achievement, right? And so has that story been told? I'm not so sure, and maybe I can help some of the listeners kind of see it also from a human perspective, an individual perspective.
I have a question
Sure,
because, uh, and let me just so you know, I don't know that you know this about me. Uh, I was born here, so I was born into the peace and
sure.
prosperity of the United States, but my family uh, escaped. My maternal side came from the Baltics,
Okay.
and my father's
Just came
family
back from that part of the world, by the way. Yeah,
my
it's
father's family
fascinating.
came
Yep.
from the Ukraine,
Okay.
and so I'm very
No, I've heard you
familiar.
talk about it.
Well,
Yep.
I mean, I'm very familiar with what happened in the
Yep.
Ukraine after the Bolsheviks got control of
Yes.
Russia. There was a slaughter, an unparalleled slaughter in the Ukraine.
Yeah.
The
By the way, just sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
Did you ever hear the story of Father Dubois, the Catholic priest?
I do not. I'm not
Okay,
familiar with it.
this is a big one, okay? And Father Dubois was a French Catholic priest who started making trips to the Ukraine maybe, I don't know, 15 years ago or so. And he started going around Ukraine and started talking to villagers about, hey, did you hear a story about all these people being rounded up and digging up their graves? And nobody wanted to talk to him initially, right? But then he could persisted, develop friendships and relationships, and then he began to discover these mass graves 15 years ago. Now, what began as a Father Dubois, if I'm hope I'm not slaughtering his name in French, right? But what began as a just one man, expedition, basically. I believe they've revised now the numbers of victims. It went on, for a long time, and it became a big operation because they discovered that 900,000 people have been identified through Father Dubois' initiative just in the last 15 years. Mass graves. That's just solidly mass graves only.
Mass
Jews.
from the World War II period we're
World War
talking about?
II, yeah, and I mean, yeah, it's just mind blowing how it's you have all these official stats and numbers and all that, but then you have people keeping quiet because of fear of retaliation or whatever, and that's just one story, not
Well, I
yeah,
grew up with
yeah,
people that came from there,
yeah.
escaped
No,
from
it's
there,
real. It's a
and
real.
they
Yeah,
have tattoos
yeah,
on their arms.
yes.
So when I listen, this is like an amazing thing for you to say because there's a lot of Holocaust revisionist history.
Oh, yeah,
And,
it's
if you're
incredible.
saying that, and I mean, we're going to take your word for it, but you're saying that this effort has found
Yes.
900,000. Now,
You
who,
check me up. I could be wrong. So don't quote on like honestly, this is so mind blowing. A lot of the numbers, like the what do you call it, the Arsolen, the Bar Arsolen archive in Germany, which contains all the records. And sometimes people say, like, where are the records? They're there. A lot of them already online. The Barcelona archive in Germany, which was selected post World War II being the most convenient hub for the tracking down of individuals, it started as a tracking down lost individuals and all that. So it's become this, it tracks 17 million people, victims, 17 million victims documentedly, tracked through that archive in Germany.
of all ethnicities
All,
and
of all.
religions,
Yes, correct.
Catholics, Jews,
Yes.
homosexuals,
And
trade unionists,
victims, period.
victims.
Victims, period, right? And in that number, of course, it's a huge number of Jews. I forget now how many were documented in the Bar Solan archive, but the biggest is the Jewish number, right? And the documents are there. So when people tell me, oh, I don't know about this, just go online. You know, look it up. Our Solan archive.
Well,
It's right there.
for me, my
Yeah.
grandfather,
Yeah.
who came from there,
Yep.
told me how his family died.
Yeah.
I mean, those people actually have identities for me.
Yeah.
And I have to be frank, and this is a strange thing, but when your grandfather starts telling you how your family members, your relatives,
Yeah.
were brutally murdered
Right.
by Ukrainians, not
Yeah.
by Germans, Ukrainian Nazis.
Yes.
And so when this allegation came up at the beginning of this war that there was Ukrainian Nazis, and people said, that's not true. And then Putin and Lavrov
Yeah.
are constantly talking about denazifying
Right.
the Ukraine. Well, let's just say, first off, there were Nazis
Yeah.
in the Ukraine.
Oh, yeah. In
And
all the countries. Yes.
and further, after the war, our OSS at the time, which became the CIA, positioned German military in the
Yes.
Ukraine to be an anti-Soviet force.
Right.
So there is an infrastructure, and we talked about it on the podcast. There's actually a movie called The Sum of All Fears, starring Ben Affleck,
Yeah.
that came out, I think, in the 90s, a Tom Clancy script.
Yeah.
And the whole subplot of the movie was that the Ukrainian Nazis were seeking to create a war between the United States and Russia.
By the way, another colorful story, very interesting, very significant that, your listeners might not be familiar with, and I find this all the time, is the Bulgarian Jews and what happened. Are you familiar with the story of the Bulgarian Jews?
I am.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So Bulgaria was an ally with Germany, right? Our King Boris was, Bulgaria after the Ottoman Empire fell apart. They decided they're going to be a monarchy, right? So we imported our royalty, much like Serbia
Wait.
and
Can we just
Romania.
bookmark this?
Yes.
I want everybody to understand the size and scope of the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah.
Now, this was based in Turkey. This was the Turkish
Yeah,
Ottoman
absolutely.
Empire. Bulgaria is how far from Turkey? It's
We're
close, but not
neighbors.
that close.
Neighbors. We're neighbors.
Well, it's pretty.
We're,
It's big territory. Big.
Bulgaria, Serbia, Greece, Romania were all part of the Ottoman Empire as a subjugated states. So basically, enslaved in a sense of like, what, the Islamic doctrine, the Sharia law would give you the option: convert or become a jizya paying, tax paying infidel, right? Or die. Basically, those are the three basic options, right? So we did have some people who converted, which are today's Bosnia, like the Bosnia-Herzegovina state, as a Muslim. These are ethnic Serbs, but they converted to Islam, and now that's become Bosnia-Herzegovina, right?
What is the percentage of Bulgarians that are Muslim now?
Bulgarian. So we have ethnic Turkish Muslims, and that's about 10%. So it's about 1 million people is the popular number that are thrown around in a country of like 7 million people, right? So it's quite significant. We actually are percentage-wise, Bulgaria has the largest number of Muslims in the European Union.
Is Bulgaria then involved in some way with Turkey? Is Turkey active politically in Bulgaria?
Turkey's always been active. Prior to '89, it was a anti-communist factor, so it was opposing force in regards to communism. But that changed later on, and they became aligned with the Turkish population inside of Bulgaria. So there's been a lot of politics. So that has always been right. But our Muslims are very different in a sense that they are very significant political factor in the parliament because they've been always like a balancing force, even though they're not the biggest number. And so it's the Balkans have been described as the the powder keg of Europe, right? Where world wars begin, and so there's a lot of ethnic and religious conflicts, very close to each other. All these countries that are very very connected and culturally, geographically. And so it's a troublesome region, and it's a balancing act to keep it like not NATO right now because of Turkey and Bulgaria allies and Romania are allies. That's probably helped quite a bit in keeping the balance. But it's a complicated history. Back to the Bulgarian Jews and
King. We had the king. It became a monarchy.
The king was told by Hitler, give up your Jews, right? And there was about 50,000 Jews at the time. And King Boris, there was intervention by the Orthodox Church. The patriarch at that time stood up and said no, and he began to advocate against that. The rabbi at the time and the patriarch were great friends, and so they fostered this relationship. They had it going before that, but so the Orthodox Church and Orthodox Christianity, doctrine wise, is really not much different than it has a lot of elements of the replacement theology, right? However,
Well, let's talk.
yeah,
You
okay.
can't run by that one because
Well, bottom line, just to finish it up. So Bulgaria did not give up its Jews. 45,000 people who were in
and then
the
what did the Nazis do with Bulgaria?
uh well, we were allies and we lost. Bulgaria being one of the Axis countries, we lost, and then the Soviet army rolled in their tanks and took over. It was basically we're a defeated country as part of World War II, and Bulgaria had for 10 years we had a national resistance against the Russians. We had over 300 they call them like partisans, basically. 300
Armed by who?
armed. They were self-armed. They were just guerrilla, right? And they were fighting for about 10 years. They fought the Russians because they did not want them. But we lost because America bowed out, so we were left on our own. And basically, our fate was sealed as this so-called 16th Soviet Republic. So we were not part of the Soviet Union as a republic, but we were so much under that influence and so much Moscow dictated. Everything was Moscow dictated.
So that resistance movement ended in the mid-50s, if I'm getting the time right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just
44 to mid-50s, correct.
Just before you were born.
I was born 69, so
Okay, but that's
yeah,
as the crow flies, it's pretty
Yeah.
close, right?
Yeah, it's an unspoken, because people are like, well, why did people accept communism? No one accepted communism. They rolled in their tanks. That's just no one would have ever accepted communism if it wasn't for violence.
And then I want to just comment and ask a question. Was Bulgaria previous to the imposition of Soviet rule? Would you say that the culture was defined by and the most prevalent force in the culture was the Orthodox Church?
The Orthodox Church had an incredibly important historic role during the Ottoman period. We're talking about 500 years of persistent attempt by, Ottoman Turkish influence, Muslim influence to assimilate and to convert. So the one thing that was left, as you mentioned, Bulgaria was like a first empire, second empire. So the one thing that was left was that unified the country and the people was orthodoxy, was Christianity, right? And so, because of its historic role in preserving the national identity and language and all these components that make up a people, right? The Orthodox Church was incredibly influential and important during that whole period and after that period. So,
But what the Turks could not accomplish, the Soviets
yeah,
did much
they
more effectively, would you say?
they did, because they dismantled, they threw in jail Orthodox, Catholic, and Protestant ministers who, in any way, demonstrated defiance towards communism. They're all thrown in jail. And much like in China, they created a official version of Catholicism, official version of Orthodoxy. So the official institutions were gutted out and replaced with officers, KGB officers.
And were many of these clerics murdered also in
Yeah,
Bulgaria, like they were in
absolutely.
other countries?
We had death camps. We had over 70 death camps in our own country where people were, thrown for opposition. And here's another curious fact. Remember the Black Book of Communism? I don't know if you've heard of that
I
one.
have not heard of that.
So after 89, sometime in the mid 90s, a bunch of European social scientists and historians came together, and they published the so-called Black Book of Communism, right? And they came out with the numbers, because people are like, well, exactly how many people died because of communism? So they came out with these numbers, and the numbers are hugely underreported, right? For example, for Bulgaria, they say the numbers are like 35,000 people are slaughtered by communists. It could be 10 times more. We just don't know. No one's really done the actual research. And the problem is that the Black Book of Communism was written mostly by socialist scientists and historians. So they really, I was like, I think they might have even done it in an attempt to distinguish socialism, which is good, from communism, which is bad. You know how the leftists sometimes position communism and they say, oh yeah, communism is probably bad, but socialism is okay. And it's really not. Socialism, economic doctrine of oppression, right, through taxation. Communism adds a gun to that. And it's like, we're not going to tax you 60, 70, 80%. We're going to actually put you in jail if you oppose us. So it's a,
Well, one of the things that I say frequently on the podcast, and I get a lot of pushback on it, of course, is I put socialists, liberals, communists, progressives, to me, they're all the same. And I'm going to say why I say that. We tend to look, or we're taught that these are systems of political economy. And they are. But we leave out the punchline. Uh,
yes,
they're godless. So, what really distinguishes it for me is that these systems of political economy are materialist without a spiritual life. And what we're talking about here is how the Turks tried to convert the Bulgarians from Orthodox
right,
Christianity
and failed.
and
Right,
failed
right,
because they were going from one faith to another. And I can see, and,
right.
but the Soviets rolled in and they gutted the churches
Yeah,
and they took over the educational system.
right.
They were much more effective in spreading.
Well, here's an interesting element to what you're saying, and it confirms it. Okay. So, I don't know, about 10 years ago, I was at a conference in Bulgaria where like they had these researchers who got together because they were still examining, how this happened. How is it even possible that you would, in one generation, you would brainwash people? And it's possible. But here's what they did, okay? So the hardcore communist ideology, which is, as you know, it hates the communist Marxist ideology, absolutely hates the natural family. Absolutely hates the nucleus of what you'd say the biblical view of man, woman, children. That's unacceptable to them. It hates national borders, right? It's an internationalist, globalist mindset and ideology from the get go. So they tried really hard to push that, right? And they failed. So what they did in the late 50s, early 60s, they switched and they said, this is not working. What we're going to do is we're going to go after all these national heroes, for example, people who were against the Ottoman Empire, national heroes, right? They were fought for liberty. So we're gonna find elements of socialism in their speeches or life or something, and so they begin to appropriate every possible nationalistic symbol and to make it like leftist communists. So what they do is, they fear nationalism and they feel national identity more than anything else. And they largely succeeded. A lot of people today, Bulgaria is still divided. We have the pro-Russian kind of camp, right? They're kind of like the children of the brainwashed who believe that Russia is the greatest thing. They don't send their kids to school there. They send them to the West, but they're waving around Russian flags, right? And then you have the pro-Western camp, which is also in a sorry state because what the West used to stand for, which was Christendom, right, and traditional values, now has become replaced by liberalism. So it's a it's a complex situation, right? To
Well,
say the least.
as a prelude, because we're going to bookmark this and come back to it, you said something that I think we're a little bit dense to here in Minnesota in the United States, that this is an internationalist movement that seeks to erase borders and identity
Hmm.
and to reprogram people into a different way of thinking, which is completely novel and overturns 100,000 years of human evolution. So, it's this is where we're going to come back to in reference to the MAGA movement, to Minnesota politics, national politics, and how these religious and political issues are so potent right now and could
Yeah.
pose a real great threat to the continuation of reestablishing the Republic of the United States. But I want to hear how it is that you were born in 69,
Yep.
right?
Hmm.
And you were born into this really pretty well developed now godless environment.
Hmm.
You went
Yes.
to I would probably
Government
presume
school.
government school
Absolutely.
where
Yep.
that was pounded into you.
Totally. Yes. Yes. Now here's the thing, though. So both sides of my family were farmers, right? My great grandfather on my mom's side was actually a veteran from the Balkan War, and he got a pension, and so he bought some land. And on my dad's side, also they were all farmers. And when communism came, anyone who had land, it was basically taken from them. They had to sign it off. My great grandfather, who impacted me a lot, I remember him vividly. We would go and he would point to these fields around the city. Every summer we would go to the village, right? And great grandfather would point to these fields, and I just would never forget the look in his eyes, and he would say, "These are our lands." They were never no somebody else's lands. This is our lands, right? And they took them all, right? So we suffered the theft at gunpoint from like basically, and they pushed people into the cities. Like my parents were from growing up in these, farmer families. They had to go to the city, and when they brought people to the city, my parents were both doctors, right? So I was raised in a family of two doctors, and politics was never discussed. Communism was never discussed. Um, it was a basically, we don't know what's going on. We're pretending like life is normal. Except one time I walked in on my dad listening to Radio Free Europe, right? And they were freaking out. Like, "Hey, don't tell anybody," right? I must have been like 12 years old. So I realized something is going on, something that no one wants to talk about. And the overwhelming sense of fear that is like a blanket that is cast over the entire culture and over everyday life literally is tangible. It's very real. And the fact that people would disappear, everyone knew people were disappearing who would tend to voice their criticism of the regime. And so and I'm growing up as a teenager, I'm like, I'm not going to live like this. I just made a vow to myself. I'm going to ask questions. I'm going to keep asking questions. And I mean, if I die, if they shoot me or disappear me, that's fine. I want to know the truth. So I started asking questions. I started, reading in the library. I found some books by Blaise Pascal, who is a French philosopher, and he wrote about God in a very, like, it was a real thing. So now as a scientist, and a philosopher who's writing about God in a very real way. That was my first interaction with Christian, thinking, right? And so this impacted me deeply. And I went to the Orthodox Church and I baptized myself. I mean, not myself. I asked to be baptized when I was a teenager because I just had a really, deep pursuit of wanting to know the truth. Why are we here? I'm looking at the stars and who made this? Who made all this? I have these questions, and they do not want you asking these questions. The school doesn't want to ask you these questions. Everybody's just like, we came from the apes. Evolution has pushed really hard in communist countries, right? And so during all these years, basically to have any kind of interest, whether it was American rock music or the Bible, it was equally threatening to the regime, right? And I had interest in both, right? Both American culture. American culture was a form of dissidency, like you were against the communist regime, if you were.
Blue jeans.
But yeah, blue jeans, long hair, all of that. So that was a big thing. But at a deeper level, I just had this like internal dissatisfaction with like seeing my parents go to work every day, trying to be quiet, trying to survive, trying to take care of their kids, and me and my brother. And so I was like, I'm not going to live like this. I just decided they want to disappear me. That's fine, but I'm going to keep asking questions, and that's what led me to the faith. Really, I connected with an underground Pentecostal church at the time. And
Underground.
yeah, they were not legal. So they told me,
And when
"Hey,"
you say Pentecostal,
yeah,
not everybody knows what that is.
yeah, there's a branch of Christianity that believes in the charismatic expression of the Holy Spirit and all that, supernatural healings and things like this. But to me, what was more important is that they were not official. And I thought, if they are not official, that means that they gotta, if there's
Good.
that's good because everything official is corrupt and can't trust it. And even the Orthodox Church, I remember my interactions with the priests. I realized how hollow they were. Like I'm searching for truth, but they were just totally void of substance. Right? There's nothing there to bring me to the faith. Right? So I started going to this disallowed church or illegal church. And that's how I came to know the Lord. And then I began to preach on the street after the regime collapsed. And there was freedom. You can go out on the street.
And what year was that for Bulgaria?
That was 89. This was shortly
Same
after
time.
89, shortly after Ceausescu got shot and around that same period of time. And basically it was chaos. After that, the best way to describe it was just controlled chaos, because the structures just disintegrated. And that gave me an opportunity to go out and start sharing my convictions. And so, talking about street preaching, I started preaching all over the city. I opened up my apartment, and mostly young people started just coming to the Lord, asking questions, and that's how my church was founded. I became a founder of a church. Actually, we grew very fast from zero in 1990 to over 1,000 people in like 3.5 years. And so it was just incredible spiritual hunger during that time. And whoever had the goods and offered it, like if you were actually on the street corner preaching, I've had over 200 people just stand there and listen for like an hour and a half. And I'm like, okay, we're done. They're like, no, we want more. I mean, this was happening all the time during like a period of like maybe a couple of years, right? And so I sensed like this is the time to do it. And so that's what I did. I graduated clinical lab school, so I was working a job, but I was going and preaching on the street.
Can we bookmark that one spot? I want to just say
Yeah,
something.
absolutely.
Okay, so politically, here's something politically everybody can think about doing, because on this podcast,
Yeah.
we're about political activism and getting people involved in American politics. So I want to just comment on, and I know you're going to agree with me. People underestimate who the communists are in our American culture and what they will do if they get control of the political levers of power. They will kill their
Yes.
opponents, because it's been the same, and it won't happen here. That's been said in a lot of countries.
Yeah.
And every time the communists get control, they basically ethnically cleanse
Yeah, absolutely.
those they cannot convert.
Yeah,
It's convert or die.
Violence was advocated by Karl Marx at the very inception of his whole movement and ideology. As you know, he was a newspaper publisher, and they shut him down because of his radical ideas, and he vowed to execute vengeance on his enemies. Violence. He was, as you know, Marx was born in a Lutheran family, even though Jewish by descent. His father was a wealthy lawyer. And in his youth, he was writing poems to Christ. I mean, Marx was a Lutheran kid writing poems to Christ. This is a historic fact, right? Then he goes to university, and a couple of years later, he starts to write poems to Lucifer. So you tell me what converted him. It wasn't Judaism. It wasn't his Jewish faith. It was the liberal, secular ideas that were pushed at his time. And he becomes a Lucifer poem writing, anarchist, basically. Incredibly chaotic person, and his life is just really interesting to read. But violence was an integral part of his entire philosophy. And even Hayek, for example, Friedrich Hayek, in his book The Road to Serfdom, he writes about how Marx was predicting that communism will take off in Britain, for example. And then they came to him and they said, well, no, the workers are happy, their wages are growing, and nobody wants to go to war with the capitalists, and he said, they'll have to. They'll have to. It doesn't matter what's happening. The facts didn't matter. What mattered was this dialectic ideology. Destroy everything so we can rebuild a utopia. And that basically is what globalists today, they spin and they push to young people. What we have now is bad. So let's destroy it. Let's destroy the historical monuments. Let's destroy the past. Let's demonize the past. And now we're going to rebuild a really nice utopia for you.
And that's such an interesting challenge.
And if you oppose it, if you oppose our utopia, we're going to kill you, basically.
Tanner, if you have any comments, you can come in any time. But let me just say, good morning, Tanner. Let me just.
Don't forget, Tanner had an important question from.
We're going to get to
that
it.
that I need to answer.
We're going to get to it. The diagnosis of far-right populism and far-left populism, which is basically Marxism, it's the same. The system is corrupt and perverse. But what we seek to do on the right is restore, strengthen, to rebuild what was the best of the roots of the culture.
Yes.
We're not anarchists. We're not looking to totally destroy. We're looking to strengthen what we believe is being destroyed.
Absolutely.
Where the left is just completely nihilistic in their approach to this problem. And, this is critical for us to understand as Americans who are born here. And because my family was savaged by the Soviets, savaged.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you lived in the Ukraine, you had Ukrainian Nazis killing you and you had Russians killing you.
Yes.
So, I mean, I had it as a story. You had it as life.
Yeah.
both of us understand that if these people get control,
Yes.
they're not kidding around. We're kidding around. And all we have to do here is be politically involved to stop them. We still have a Republican democracy, a democratic republic where we can be politically active. And to the point I wanted to make when I said bookmark that, you're talking about street preaching. So what we do here in Minnesota is we go to the sports events.
Yeah.
We go groups of Republicans. And I don't mean like the Republican Party, because they don't have the time to go out
Right.
where it's dangerous.
Right.
I'm talking about people that believe in the philosophy of republicanism.
Right.
We go to the Twins games. We go to the Vikings game. We stand there in testimony that it's okay to be a Republican.
Yes, absolutely.
And then it's interesting. There's one Christian guy that's there not preaching republicanism. He's preaching pure Christianity. And you talked about 200 people
Well,
coming and stand.
the
People
street,
people walk by him
yeah,
like he is insane.
yeah,
And
right.
that is how secularized
Yes.
our culture has become.
Well, it would be very similar to today and now if I went on the streets of the same exact city, and that would be the same. Like materialism is also utopianism to some degree, right? And the utopia is that if you get all these trinkets and achieve material success, that affirms you as a successful individual, so forth and so on. They don't tell you what you need to sacrifice, to get there. Maybe get there, maybe not, but they don't tell you what you need to sacrifice. Sacrifice babies, sacrifice your life, sacrifice this and that. So every utopia has a price you pay, right? And in the mind of a globalist or socialist, it's okay to pay that price. We're going to have to kill 1 million people so we can keep 20 million in subjection? No problem, because the utopia is there, right? Islam is a utopia as well, right? And they're ready to kill in the name of that utopia, and they've been doing it since the 7th century. So every utopia that transforms itself from a faith or a philosophy into an actual ideology that seeks power, stay away. It's dangerous because this is what I say: communists. Like I was telling you before we start recording that after '89, the different socialist or communist countries had different development, and like the Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, they accepted laws that said basically if you're involved if you're a member of the Communist Party, you cannot have political power at all ever again. So they cut the connection between power because there's no such thing as former communists, right? I mean, maybe
It's
some
like
extent.
denazification in a
Yeah,
way.
it kind of. Oh, we actually have laws that ban the Communist Party and communism, right? It's like an alcoholic. Once alcoholic, always alcoholic, and that's what I say. These people that impose on utopia at gunpoint, when they lose power, don't let them have it. They can never reform, right? Normal people like you and I who actually want to live their lives and don't really even care about politics, we're forced to do this because we're seeing the republic falling apart, right? But normal people have other concerns. They got to take care of life. They got to do this and that. But the ideologues and the utopians, man, that's their job. That's what they're fixated on: get the power and impose. And then that's the basic conflict of globalism and what do you call communism. It's driven by this militant lobby that seeks to impose their own version of utopia, be it transgenderism is the new utopia or DEI or whatever it is. They fixate on that, and that's how they recruit young minds, unsuspecting minds, and they get them all. Or the Jew hatred. That's the same thing. It's the same poison. Drink that poison. We'll explain to you the world through the prism of Jew hatred. We'll blame it all on the Jews. Does that make sense now to you? Oh, sure, right? And so this kid who doesn't know much, then he's just like, okay, that makes sense. They're responsible for everything. That's the utopian enforcers.
Well, let's dwell on that because you
Okay.
made the comment that what brought us together for this podcast
Sure.
was the question Mr. Tanner asked
Yes.
on the last podcast. Do you remember your question?
Yes.
Why don't you restate it and let's talk about it?
Okay, my question was I didn't understand why the Christians wanted to help the Jews if the Jews historically had killed Christ.
Great. Excellent question. And I that's what brought me to David. I was like, David, Tanner had a question. It needs to be answered adequately, please. So we can go on for like a long time, but essentially, to keep it at a high level and kind of frame it correctly, a question like that reveals really a lack of understanding of the basic framework of biblical redemption.
Okay.
And what it is, it omits completely. So when someone pinpoints that and kind of makes you obsessed and focus on like this one fact, what they're missing big time is the fact that the the biblical narrative and worldview posits that mankind fell and rebelled against God, and so you have this redemptive story. You have the covenant with Abraham. From Abraham comes Israel, the nation of Israel, the people of Israel, and Jesus was one of them. He was a Jewish man who grew up as a Torah observant Jew and so
A
forth and
rabbi.
so on.
A
Rabbi,
rabbi.
rabbi, exactly. The 12 so-called disciples were
All
basically
Jewish.
Talmidim. They were students of the rabbi, right? But here's the biggest kicker.
You got a Hebrew word there. That was
It's
very good.
exactly. So the the thing that excuse me, that they're missing is that, for example, I got the scriptures because it's important to get this right. 1 Peter 1:18-19, the apostle Peter says, "You are ransomed from the futile ways inherited from your forefathers, not with perishable things such as gold or silver, but with the precious blood of Christ, like that of a lamb without blemish or spot. He was foreknown before the foundation of the world, but was made manifest in the last times for the sake of you." So this whole concept of God, before he even created the worlds, he saw the potential scenario of the fall and the potentially price he had to pay and send his son, and he did it anyway. So in other words, the foreknowledge of Christ's crucifixion or death, sacrificial death, was built into the entire creation act. So therefore, it's very much within God's own will that he said, you know what, I'm going to create this world and they will fall. And in order for me to redeem them, I'll have to go and pay the price, but I'll do it, right? And so the so-called killing of Christ becomes a moot point because it was preordained, it was planned, it was actually an act of love. It was an act of love from God to his creation that he would even go and pay that price. So, the killing of Christ, even the term itself, literally brings you into this context of vengeance. It's like, who are the sides here? Who is killing who is revenge?
It's obscuring the redemptive act.
Completely. Now,
Now,
so
do you understand do you get
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, that does make a lot of sense.
and
I
it's
can
not the only
understand that.
scripture. So sometimes it's very dangerous to create a doctrine or a teaching on one verse. So I'm going to point out to something else. Here's an important one in Isaiah 53, the entire chapter, which Jews and Christians have a disagreement on who is the servant spoken of in that chapter. But the entire chapter in Isaiah 53 speaks of a servant who will come and suffer to the point of death. So I'm pointing out to the fact that this is throughout scripture. In the book of Revelation, it also speaks, chapter 13 and verse 8. It says that the Lamb was slain from the foundation of the world. And then Jesus himself in John 17:24 says, this is the last prayer, they call it the priestly prayer. He says, "You loved me before the foundation of the world." So you have this whole plan that was divinely conceived and executed regardless of whose hands were performing the act. We might as well say the Romans. Why don't we have an anti-Roman doctrine? We should, and I say this to my friends sometimes because I have friends who have different views, right? And say, okay, fair enough. The Jews killed Christ. Well, how about the Romans? How did you omit them? So if we go by that logic, we should have, the doctrine of exterminate all Romans or Italians because they were at least equally responsible. Where's that doctrine? Where's that ideology? Where's that perspective? Why are we missing that? Why are we missing the fact that all the disciples were Jews, their disciples were Jews, and for 300 years you have predominantly Jewish movement that slowly integrated non-Jews, but it was carried by Jews, right? Spoken
Well,
Hebrew.
still to this day.
Matthew wrote the first original story, not the gospel, but Matthew's writings, which theologians call the Q version. We have historic references that he wrote it in Hebrew. So they're all Hebrew speaking, Torah observant Jews, right? None of this aligns with the who killed Christ. None of them spoke about that. There's no evidence of that Christ killing accusation, which developed much later on. Constantine, and then um, you have theologians in the fourth century who began purposely to kind of take that spin because they really wanted to separate Jews and Christians. Jews and Christians were worshiping together on Shabbat. Jews and Christians were celebrating Passover or Easter, what we call now. And so actually there's an imperial edict by Emperor Constantine. It took an imperial edict to say, you know what? No, we're going to separate you guys. You can't do all this stuff together. So for 300 years, you have Jews and Christians kind of like in a similar camp. The Christians were called Nazarenes, or they were called different names. They were called the Nutzerim, right? They were called the Ebionites or whatever, but there were 30 to 50% of Jews at the time were Messianics or Notzarim. And in fact, something interesting, during the last great revolt, the Bar Kokhba revolt,
Mm-hmm.
the Notzarim, the Jesus followers who were Jewish, were so great in number that the rabbis, Rabbi Akiva at that time, he said, Bar Kokhba is our Messiah. He's going to lead us, and we're going to liberate ourselves from Rome, right? And so the Notzarim, the worshipers of Jesus, said, no, we already have a Messiah. He's Yeshua, right? So they bowed out, and they did not support the revolt against Rome. That is where an internal split happened.
Right.
And they said, you know what? That's where there's a Jewish prayer that curses Christians and all that. That's what it originated, because they're like, oh, you betrayed our national cause now.
The tribe.
Because you're not going to follow Bar Kokhba as a Messiah. You're going to follow your own Yeshua. So these are internal things that were happening through the centuries, but there was never a Christ-killing accusation, right? The other thing that it omits, the foreknowledge and the plan of God for this to happen is a big one, right? How can you develop a Christ-killing doctrine if God himself said, I'm going to sacrifice myself out of love? And whose hands were on the Messiah at that time? Tanner, really the reality, who killed Christ? We all did. Because if he came to die for the sins of the world, guess what? The sin of the world is what pinned him on that cross. And for someone to come in and say, oh, by the way, all those sinners are better than that group, it's just incredibly intellectually dishonest and not scriptural. The other thing is, okay, I'm going to pause here because it's a lot. And
Well,
does that make sense, Tanner? I mean,
Yeah, I just want to clarify. I'm just asking the question to ask. I don't believe that we should pin it on the Jewish people. I guess where I get really confused is that Christians and Jews have different ideas for what redemption is, and I feel like that doesn't align. So why would they work together?
because the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is the God that we worship. I've been to the Wailing Wall. I've been to Israel many times, and I've been in Muslim countries. And I can tell you that at a very existential level, that I've been to Buddhist countries. I've been to over 60 countries around the world, and I've preached in over 40 of them, right? And, if you have any level of spiritual awareness, when you walk into, for example, I was in Myanmar, in one of the biggest, it's the biggest Buddhist temple in the world, right? And the sense, the overwhelming sense of a demonic power and cult when you see people on the ground and doing things, the overwhelming sense of oppression in Muslim Indonesia. I've been in the heart of Java, where I've led Bible study, and at the same time the imam is blasting, with the call to prayer. When you go to Israel, you go to the Wailing Wall, right? There is no that sense. You know that we are seeking the same God. The difference, the doctrinal differences that we have, the different interpretation as to whether Jesus was the Messiah or he's yet to come, that's to me an internal difference. It can in no way, shape, or form should be a reason for us to develop hostile ideology or exclusive, like either or. There's no such either or. Do you know, for example, that in the 16th century, like we have this Bible today, right? In the 16th century, it was Jewish scholars who were mostly responsible for the new translations of the Bible. After 1,000 years of the Roman Catholic, Roman version of the Bible or translation, the reformers of the 16th century formed an alliance with Jewish rabbis to go back to the original language. It's called Christian Hebraism. And they were like, let's work together to go back to scripture to really understand better the text, because the foundational text is in Hebrew, right? And so Jews have contributed tremendously through the centuries, and the Jewish Christian alliances have contributed tremendously for Christians to better understand their faith. And we just basically, I can have a discussion with any Jew about theological differences to build an entire ideology on top of that. And what's called a replacement theology that says, no, you're no longer special, you're no longer nobody. Christians have replaced the Jews. That is called the replacement theology, and it's basically it's built on a wrong premise. It excludes the writings of Paul. It excludes a whole lot from the Bible and just kind
What
of focuses.
groups? I mean, can you identify in terms of organizations? What organizations tend to focus on that replacement?
Replacement?
Yeah.
Replacement theology is at on many levels and many denominations, many churches. They don't speak of it openly. Sometimes you're probably not going to find it as a page in their, beliefs or creed. But what it does is when you go to the seminary level, you go to, popular books level sermons. It's just being peppered. They pepper this whole entire um, idea, and over a period of time, people just begin to adopt the "Who killed Christ" attitude.
But it comes back to the Roman Empire separated these communities, and there was
Very
also
much
that,
so.
and there was that revolt, the Bar Kokhba issue. So that was within Jewish culture,
Yes,
but there was an edict from
Emperor Constantine.
why?
Yes.
Why did he do that?
So Constantine, at the time when he was an emperor, he was a very unstable character. If you know a little bit about his history, he really needed popular support, right? And he looked at the Roman Empire and he asked his advisors, who can support me in this whole entire empire? And that's really the history of how Christianity became legal in the Roman Empire. So they said, well, look at these guys. They're the most organized group. They show up every week. They go to these meetings. And so he made allies with the Christians. There's this whole story about him seeing a cross or his mother, but that's not, whether that's history or not, that's a whole different story. But what's true is that he found great support in the at that time underground Christians, right, to save Rome. Now, also, if you read Saint Augustine, the City of God, particularly, which is a very voluminous, it's like 900 pages, and I recommend it to everyone, but it's pretty serious reading, right? You can really understand from Saint Augustine's writing the heart of a Roman who's also a Christian. Like these people love Rome the way we love America today. I kid you not. Like if you read Augustine, you will see that to them, to be a Roman was a big deal, right? This was the civilization. These are the guys who built aqueducts, right? They had families, they had lands, they saw themselves as
The empire.
absolutely, absolutely. So for them now, accepting Christianity for Constantine was a big deal because he's replacing all these idols and false gods, right? And so essentially, part of the reason Christian theologians at that time saw the Jews as a problem is because they're competing ideology to what was a empire strengthening
Because you had
group.
this group of Jewish revolutionaries that were fighting the empire.
Well, and they were always a thorn in someone's butt, right? They were like, no, well, you guys believe all this, but now we got our own idea. So as far as I'm concerned, I like that. I like people who are contrarian by nature. I'm like, really? You don't believe the same as me? Tell me why, right? But not all people are like that. People who have power like to consolidate and suppress, so that's kind of like the story. He came in as like, you worship on Sunday. That's it. You're a Christian. So it was really an attempt by both theologians at that time, like Chrysostomus and the emperor, to consolidate power and unify. And it was very much a political creation of political Christianity because it was for 300 years. It was very much in homes. There was no temples. They were gathering in a synagogue on Shabbat and at homes on Sunday. It was very much a home-based Christianity. Constantine created an institution. He started appointing
One could
bishops.
say he co-opted Christianity, couldn't?
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, I
Yeah.
think this is where we get into the whole spread of Christianity throughout Europe,
Yes.
all the way to the British Isles, and then the whole characteristic of it changes, and that leads us to America. So, but I do want to say, just because I think it's so interesting, I want to and when you're watching tonight on YouTube
Mhm.
and you're in the live chat, if you want to, you read the live chat or you go read the comments afterwards. I can't guarantee this, but there are going to be people that disagree with you.
Well, that's fine with me.
But
That's
but
okay.
my point is, what you're saying from a Christian frame
Hmm.
is that God's plan
Yes.
was for this redemption.
Yep.
So why are we blaming the Jews for playing a role in God's plan? And the Jews
Exactly.
have a role in God's plan.
Yeah, even Paul in his discourse in the book of Romans goes out to say, well, even Pharaoh, it was predestined kind of Pharaoh to be who he is. So there's almost this whole element of it's a dangerous territory, free will versus predestination.
I was just going to bring that up.
It's a really touchy one. And the rabbis, if you study rabbinical writings, especially from the first century and prior to Jesus' time, they were all discussing this whole um, the divide that we have to the liberal conservative divide and also the predestination versus free will. Those discussions they were had between rabbis
For 100,000 years. Yeah.
exactly. And then Christians had them later on, but basically it's very difficult to I mean it's very easy to explain if you have the larger context and you understand the Bible as a redemptive story, pinpointing, the differences to the Jews and the Christians, rather seeing that these groups, the Jewish um, people, as those to whom the scripture were given. That's what Paul says. Uh, he highlights the fact that without them we wouldn't have scripture. Without them we wouldn't have Messiah. Right? God could have caused Messiah to be born from a Chinese girl in Beijing. Right? Why didn't he do that? Because there's a story. There's continuity. He calls Abraham a man who was not particularly. We don't know much about his ethnicity. Ur of the Chaldeans or whatever, and he crosses over the river Jordan. The word Hebrew comes from the Hebrew word heber, which means the cross over. So the crossing over now transforms him into obedient follower of Yahweh or Yehovah, depending on what you believe, how the special name is pronounced, right? And this Torah observant culture is born, and it basically the temple and the tabernacle and the observation of these doctrines of these precepts by God form a culture from which the Messiah is born. Whether now or in the future, it's from a culture. Jesus didn't come from Mars. He didn't drop from the sky. He had a background. He spoke Hebrew. He observed the
He
Torah.
studied the Torah.
And so if you remove basically the Old Testament, his history, he becomes a Martian. Like he could have dropped anywhere on earth. But no, God says, no, there's a history here. Because he's a God of families, God of
There's a lineage.
there's continuity. And what's important to people today? I have a grandchild. When I look at my grandson, you see yourself. You're like, wow, here's my child had a child, right? And that's God's story as well, a story of continuity. So to fragment it and take one piece, and here it's one of the worst things you can do. You have to look at the entire story and the entire
What is the
perspective.
benefit of fragmenting it? Let's go on to the other street.
Sectarianism.
Sectarianism.
Yeah, people who focus and become obsessed with a segment of the story, but not the entire story, usually are either intellectually deficient or, in my opinion, or have an agenda of some kind to draw people to put together a movement or whatnot, or power-seeking individuals, like you were saying. Even a good person, when given power, if there's no checks and balances, chances are they'll screw up. Right?
Of course, the idea is to be check and balance inside. That's the
The
ultimate.
hardest. Yeah,
Well, you have to work for it. I
absolutely.
mean, that's the process of redemption.
Yes.
And the anti-Semitism, it is actually terrifying. And it really ties into this whole political environment we find ourselves in, which brought us together to have this conversation, which is, I'm an officer in the Republican Party, and I'm really involved in this political thing. And I've been deposed now because I'm searching for truth. We got a lot of folks in the party that are toting a line,
Yeah.
and that line is not working. And, I say to people like the leader of the party, Alex Plekish, hey, if it was working, I'd be all for it.
Yeah.
But it's a failure here in Minnesota, and keep doing the same thing over and over again. So here's what we're doing here in Minnesota. We've got a group of Christian evangelicals which are extraordinarily supportive of Israel to the extent of,
Can I interrupt you?
please,
I'm sorry, because it just flashed in my mind. Something we talk about. Tanner might find this interesting because
go ahead.
it's one thing to talk about historic Israel and historically the Jews. It's another thing when you cross over into now and today and say, well, what does this have to do with Israel today?
You're stealing my thunder.
So,
Proceed.
but I mean, Christian Zionism, right? And here's the thing: people don't understand that Christian Zionism originally originated in the 16th century, and Europe back. Blackstone was a Zionist, right?
50 years before there was Jewish Zionism, there was Christian Zionism. 50 years it predated Jewish Zionism.
I mean, the history is amazing because these Christians, like Blackstone, for example, you can read their writings, and they had no concept of Palestine or none of these issues. They studied Scripture. And they didn't even look at prophecy. And this is what I want to say. True Christian Zionism is not tied to prophecy. I'm anti that. Like, that to me is I know there's a lot of people,
Okay,
and I'm
so
not going to blame
let's
them.
go back. Then we have to go back one frame to sola scriptura and the fracturing of the church, because there's a lot of the fracturing. The Protestant movement is part of what you're talking about. I think part of that is a
The
disengagement.
authority of the Bible versus the authority of popes and cardinals and such.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, okay, yeah, that's true. Not all Christian movements accept the Bible as the ultimate authority. It's always like for Catholics, it's the Bible and such and such and such. For the Orthodox Church is the same. The Bible and
The
the
church
writings,
hierarchy.
50-50, right? Even Judaism looks at the Tanakh and says, "Oh, Tanakh is good, but we have the oral law, right?" So the emergence of the Protestant Christianity, which says, no, the Bible is the ultimate authority, similar to the Karaites in the Jewish world.
Mm-hmm.
You have the Karaites who are scriptural Jews. They only acknowledge the Torah. Like they don't look at the writings of rabbis. That's secondary. They maybe use them or not. Similar to that, in the Christian world, the idea of the Bible as the defining authority is pretty unique in that sense, right? The problem is when you attach prophecy and you say, oh, I support Israel because I believe that based on the prophecy or my view of end times, then I'll support Israel because they have to go back to the land. Actually, the return to the land is part of biblical prophecy, not because of end times, but just because God says, one day I will bring them back to their land, period. It doesn't say I'll bring them back to the land because of the end times. The prophecies in the Old Testament specifically.
Ingathering.
The ingathering is prophesied by the prophet Ezekiel, by Isaiah, and it's a promise for all Jews all the time.
And let me
right?
just say, and this is critical from the Jewish perspective, what they called the diaspora, the forcing out of the Jews from the Holy Land. The people that raised me, the religious Jews that raised me, accepted that as God's punishment, that the Jews were scattered by divine will because of their failure to follow and to love God with all their heart and all their soul and all their might. So the importance of being in the diaspora, the importance of supporting the country you lived in, the importance of suffering this fracturing of the community was part of the redemption of the Jewish people. So when the state of Israel was formed in 48, the religious that raised me didn't want Israel to be formed. They viewed that as a Marxist political movement that had nothing to do with Judaism. They viewed it completely differently. They didn't support it. It was really only after Jerusalem was recaptured in 1967 that the religious in the United States started to go back to Israel. And I can't prove this, but I personally think that they didn't want to leave Jerusalem in the hands of communists. So,
well, whatever you think, at the end of the day, it boils down to very much, and maybe I'm going back to the fact that I was raised in a communist country, and you have to understand, in communism, there's very much an existential issue. It's a life and death issue. It's an issue of if I speak up, maybe I'll disappear, right? Here, you're speaking up. You're one of 10 million people who speak up. It's a matter of like maybe get rejected by someone who's watching the live stream. So what? Big deal. They rejected me. I don't care. But in the communist society, you may be disappeared. The entire Bible, all the scriptures were given in the context of existential issues. At the time of Jesus, the average length of life was 28 years old. People were dying like flies from sickness and disease. The issue of eternity was not an intellectual exercise, right? And to the Jews today, if you go to Israel, you'll realize that it's an existential issue. They don't give a flip about our disagreements or this and that. They need a home where they will live, and it's promised in the Bible. Do you really need more than that? That God says, I will one day bring you back and I will give you safety in your own land that was given to Abraham, and you lived in it for, by the way, they never really, yes, they were scattered, but Jews always remained in the land. It's called Eretz Israel, the land of Israel. And for 2,000 years, yes, they were scattered. They didn't have their own state, but there were always Jews in the land. On top of that, when they start coming back to Israel, they were buying the land. They were buying swamps and turned them into kibbutzim. And, they turned them into a prosperous. When I was in the desert, I remember years ago, we went to a kibbutz in the Negev desert. They were exporting tulips for Holland. How do you raise tulips and export them to Holland, right? Incredible people, just incredibly creative and ingenious people. So you have existential issue. We have intellectual and maybe political bickering. They have an existential issue. And you must understand the discussion here. For someone in America, a keyboard warrior, they may be having their opinions. For a Jew in Israel, that's a matter of life and death potentially. So it's not just a simple practice of intellectual, theological discourse. It's a matter of like, yes, it's in the Bible. It's promised. The land is promised to the Jewish people, and we're here by God's providence. And that's really, you don't need much more than that. If you're against that, if you're chanting from the river to the sea, what you're really saying is kill all the Jews, basically. The river from the river to the sea literally is a coded appeal to just get rid of the Jews, because that's what the enemies want, right? And
Well,
lastly,
but this is an interface. Then that is an interface between ancient biblical ideas and modern political realities. So, of course, I don't support that idea because I'm Jewish. But if you go back to Blackstone, you're talking about that founding of the Christian Zionist
Yep.
movement in the empire. That was quickly co-opted,
it was.
and it was used to
It's inevitable.
attack the
Yeah.
Ottoman Turks.
Yes.
And so it became a political, and then you had the Sykes-Picot Agreement at, downstream after the Turkish Empire fell. The empire didn't fall because of Jewish immigration, but that didn't help. I mean, it was the Turkish Empire fell because as all empires, they fall from within. But the use of Jewish immigration, and I say use because I don't think it was benign. I think it was a financed immigration with the intent to change the political
Well,
structure.
Theodore Herzl wrote about it 50 years before before the Holocaust. Okay, Theodore Herzl was a journalist who witnessed the Dreyfus affair in France, and he watched civilized France. He went as a journalist to cover the trial of this general who was accused of treachery, a Jewish general who was exonerated from all the accusations, by the way, right? And so this Theodor Herzl is this German journalist who's going there just as a journalist to cover the trial of a French Jewish general, right? And he is shocked to see the French just turn into beasts on the streets and scream for the destruction and the killing of the Jews. He came back, said, we need our own place. That was the birth of Zionism, basically. And the theory, it had nothing to do with, it had to do with existential threat again.
For the
right?
Jews in Eastern Europe, it did.
Yeah, absolutely.
But what did it have to do with for the British? I mean, the British used that. I believe they used that movement, but they also had Protestant.
Maybe so, but if you want to survive, David, right?
The Eastern European Jews needed to
You would
survive.
make allies, right? You would make allies. Like, for example, Netanyahu was on a podcast with Ben Shapiro a few days ago, and he talked about his father lobbying both Republicans and Democrats to, basically, hey, align with us, and so we can, basically, again, help us survive, right? I understand having to survive. I'm not going to blame anyone if everybody's after you trying to destroy you and you're going to try to survive. You may have to make allies with people you don't really necessarily like, ethically, hopefully, right? But people forget these are not just ideas. At the end of the day, we're talking about the lives of people. How about the people that talk about the Christ killing forget the fact that Hitler produced the Nazi Bible? You ever heard of the Nazi Bible?
No.
Okay, so the Nazis created their own version of the Bible and they eradicated in it. It's a translation, modern translation in Germany. That's a historic truth. And the Nazi Bible eradicates all the Jewish mentions and, basically is turning into an Anglo-Saxon original document of some kind. So that's to the degree of depravity that these people's minds, it's just like Jew hatred is like in my opinion, is like a infection of some kind. It's just brain rot. I mean, what would cause you to go and scrap I don't know how much of the Bible they scrap, right? But what would even give you the idea you can write a new version of the Bible, only to remove the Jewish influence? You can't even do that. It's ridiculous, right? But just the intent, this incessant intent in some people they just hate the Jews. Something in them, it's irrational actually. It's a spiritual thing. And the problem in America today, I think, as I'm listening to, monitoring the conversation on X, the problem is that I see is that you have the Jew hating right or left, but you also have the poorly equipped Christians who mostly support Israel because of eschatological or prophecy positions, which in my opinion that's a poor position. The middle.
Let's talk about that.
Yeah.
Let's really focus
Okay.
on the scripture and the politics of why you're saying it's an intellectually and scripturally weak.
Yes, I could do that.
That'd be
very
great.
briefly. So eschatology is the study of end times or the last times. How would the world end? Here's a question. So if you go to Hebrews chapter 6, in the beginning, the author of Hebrews, nobody agrees perfectly that it's Paul, but let's just say the author of Hebrews, the book of Hebrews, right? He mentions the foundational doctrines of Christianity: repentance of dead works, the teaching on baptisms, faith in God, laying on of hands, the resurrection of the dead, and judgment. If you look at those 6 that are being listed there, doctrines, if you will, or that package, it kind of offers to you the whole entire philosophy of like, here's how you come into the kingdom of God. Here's how you live into the kingdom of God by faith, right? And here's the end, the teaching on, the end time. There will be an end to this creation according to the Bible, right? So the problem is when we get into a whole lot of guessing how exactly the end will come, right? This is where all the eschatological schools differ, because you have the different views. You have the amillennial view, which is historically the longest view, which is the Catholic Church view. Is like the amillennial view is looking at, the book of Revelation as a metaphor. The millennium is really a metaphor for the reign of Christ on earth. Now, there's really no 1,000 years of Christ on the earth. There's the pre-tribulation view that says, well, there will be a rapture before Christ comes. There's the mid-trib, post-tribulation, and so forth and so on. All of these views, right, are basically, in one way, you can say speculation. We don't have a historic evidence that during the early years of Christianity, if you call it that was important to anyone. They basically believed that the end will come one day. We don't know where it is. Christ himself said, don't try to guess it. Don't name dates, right? And live purely as if you would die tomorrow, but don't obsess over how exactly the end will come. It has no relevance to salvation. How the end will come has no relevance to the redemptive story.
Right.
The redemptive story
that's a very Jewish position, by the way.
It is. I mean, it is. That's where we align again. The state of man, the condition of man, the condition of the world you live in, accepting responsibility for your own condition before you go around blaming other people is very much a biblical redemptive concept, right? And so to become even pro-Israel solely based on your eschatological views, in my opinion, is not the original Christian Zionism. The original Christian Zionism, deeply rooted in just biblical fulfillment of the promise that God gave to Israel. You have your land, one day it'll be back. period, end of story.
I have a weird question about
Sure.
that.
Yeah.
So there's no room for misunderstanding that Israel is just all land on earth? Is it specifically this continent and that area that they are at, or could it be
Well,
up for?
historically, that was their land.
Yeah.
Historically, you have coins, inscriptions. You have a lot of archaeological evidence going back 1,000 years before Christ. So that's 3,000 years of history that was the land of Israel, spoken of in the Bible,
Right.
archaeologically confirmed. Why would they go elsewhere, right?
Well, no, and I understand that. I guess I'm confused. Where did I know the story of Israel is wrestling with God, right, or something along those
We're
lines?
talking about Jacob now.
Jacob. Yeah.
Jacob. So that's where the name had come from.
It was changed by God from Jacob to Israel, from, deceiver, because that was the name given at birth, to prince with God.
Okay.
Israel means a prince with God, right?
Okay. Continue. Sorry, I just wanted to ask that because I could kind of see it if like I just have a really hard time wrapping my head around why it's this piece of land and
Essentially,
why
it's in the Bible.
specifically that.
It's biblical.
Okay.
It's literally in the biblical text. He gives the borders, and it's actually much less land today than what the biblical borders are. If the Jews were fanatics, they would go
call
say,
it Greater Israel.
Exactly. If the Jews were really fanatics, the fanatics that they say they are, they would be arming themselves. They would be teaching their kids, one day we'll become great Israel. Look at the biblical boundaries of Israel. They're not doing that. They're not doing that, because if you look at the original boundaries that God gives to Abraham, they're much bigger. They're going to Jordan. They go into all these different. So the Jews are kind of like, yeah, this used to be all our land and promised to us by God, but we'll settle for this, right?
Can we just live here in peace?
Can you just leave us alone so we can live here?
This is the part that really has gotten lost over the course of my lifetime. Israel is viewed now as a very militaristic and tyrannical state by the left, particularly. But I know the whole essence of being a believer, when people talk about the Torah, when they tell you, we want you to learn this book, here's what they say. All its paths are paths of peace. So if you steep yourself in the study of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, the idea is to bring about peace and prosperity, well-being. It's not about being a militarized state in perpetual war.
Here's a good one, and you probably know more about that, but Tanner, that might be curious for you. Actually, a minority of Jews today believe, even Orthodox Jews, if you ask them about a coming Messiah, talking about the disagreement between Christians and Jews, a lot of Jews don't even believe in a historical Messiah coming. They just believe in the Messianic age, maybe, right? It's only a segment of Jews that actually believe in the coming of today, right now, I'm saying. If you look at, there's research.
There's different eschatologies, for sure.
They've changed through the ages their understanding of what a Messiah is. So now a lot of Jews in Judaism, they're like, well, maybe it's not a particular figure. Maybe it's just an age that's going to come. They're really striving towards peace. Basically, they want, leave us alone, we'll leave you alone, essentially, right? And that's been lost because of propaganda. Because if you look at from the Theodore Herzl saying we need our own state to protect ourselves, to down all the way to today, yes, they may have gone off into, Israel spied on so-and-so. Yeah, everybody spies on everybody. Really? You're going to pinpoint the Jews when the reality is, they're really good at cyber. Why not? You be good at cyber too if you want. It's a free market. They're smart. Well, yeah, go ahead, be smart too. What did the Jews have to do? In Europe, they were not allowed to have land, for example. The Jews could not own land in Europe, right? So they developed lending. You want your money transported from Rome to London in the 14th century? You know who was going to do that? The Jews. They had a little community here in London, and they put it in the money in the courier's pocket, and they said, you know what? You need to transport this money from Genoa to London, and for a small fee. Okay, this is how modern lending was born. Okay, and so they developed that whole internal system. What else to do? They got no land, so they went into knowledge, services. Right? They became advisors to kings because what do? You're studying the Torah all the day, and one rabbi said, we've been trying to figure out how to con God for how many centuries, right? That's why we're smart lawyers. It's study of the scripture, of the thought.
Well, we talked about that briefly, about the capturing of the word. The ability to manipulate the word.
Yes.
And I know this you have to actually, it's not a Jewish thing, it's a human thing. There are people that have found an ability to connect with creativity.
Yeah.
And it's not owned by the Jews,
No.
but the Jews are just very good at it because it's taught father to son. That
Yeah.
ability to study, to inquire, to create, that's the essence of being Jewish.
Yeah, very
And
much.
it could be the essence. My feeling has got nothing to do with being Jewish. It's got to do with being human. But
And the circumstances too. The circumstances
well, you were
forge
talking
and
about
yeah,
that.
they shape you into, be a lawyer and
The
teachers.
times make the warrior.
Exactly.
The times make the warrior.
So you have to understand the human history. You have to understand the best way to understand an issue is what is the story behind it. Every time someone takes something out of context and they develop this whole thing.
I didn't know we were going to go this direction. I like this because I struggle with all this anti-Semitism that I see on X like you do. I really didn't plan on talking about this anti-Semitism in this way at this time, but it does tie in. You said something that is a bombshell that some of the listeners and viewers are going to have to cogitate on. Your theory of the case is that the eschatology is not necessarily correct. The way this ingathering is being portrayed as the uh, preface to the return of Christ,
Mm-hmm.
if I understand you correctly, you're saying from your perspective, that reading of the Holy Script
Yes.
is incorrect. Do I understand you correctly?
Absolutely. I do not believe support for Israel has to be based on eschatology at all. Now, if you do, I'm fine with that. If that's your reading, if you come from a school of thought that says, "Oh, it's going to happen like this. Israel has to be brought to the land because of the Antichrist." Well, I don't even believe. Where in Scripture does it speak of a literal Antichrist? Do you know that is not even in the Bible? Okay, it speaks of the spirit of Antichrist, but it never really points out to a person that says this person will be Antichrist. One time it speaks of the man of sin. And you're going to base an entire doctrine on one verse? I'm sorry. Okay. Then people hop over to the book of Revelation and they take components of the book of Revelation and they put together these theories, which is fine. You want to have a theory, you have freedom of speech, you can do whatever you want. But don't tell me you're going to take a verse, a single verse, and you're going to construct. And actually, the idea of a physical antichrist is pretty relevant. This is like the Schofield Bible. This is like end of 19th century type stuff. So it's a pretty recent development that we believe in some antichrist coming who will be in Jerusalem, right? And the Jews are in the mix somehow with antichrist. Maybe he will be even Jewish. This is all. Is just to me, it's speculation. And support for Israel should not come based on eschatological interpretation.
Yet, what we're what we're exploring,
Yeah.
is that exact strain. I don't know how to say it. That exact movement, which is giant in the Republican
It is.
Party,
Yeah.
Christian evangelical belief, this eschatological belief, started with Billy Graham. Really, Billy Graham was the progenitor, the most popular progenitor of it. It influenced Nixon. It influenced Reagan. It's influenced Trump. Trump actually is on tape saying that the reason he moved the American embassy to Jerusalem, he says, this is for the evangelicals. And we have this Christians United for Israel, which we have a very strong contingent of that here in Minnesota, which comes from Living Word Church. Mac Hammond, who I've watched since I was young. He used to have the Winner's Minute on television. And you're really taking a contrarian position to that.
It is contrarian. It is contrarian. And like I said, from a Jewish perspective, and because I love Israel, okay, let me just go on record and say, I love Israel. I see myself as a joined in to the tribe, and I respect and
that's scriptural.
It's scriptural. We are grafted in. And we must have a deep, profound appreciation. Do you know that how many Jews were killed for simply copywriting, like copying the Torah? Do you know that they were considering each letter of the Torah so sacred that they would, the scribes when they create a Torah scroll, that's what they do. Like it's meticulous. It's a meticulous job to handwrite, make sure every character. They would go wash their hands. They would pray before that. The level of dedication to the Torah is, we Christians have no concept.
I have a story for you.
Yeah.
I've told it before, but I'm going to tell it to you. So, I was raised in a pretty religious frame.
Sure. Yeah.
So what they do with young kids like me who they hope go to rabbinical school, they call it yeshiva. My father was a yeshiva bocher. So I was raised by very religious people. So they give you an opportunity to participate in the creation of a Torah scroll when I'm young. I mean, just right after I'm bar mitzvah. And it has to be done perfect.
Yeah.
There's no error.
Exactly.
Practice for a long time because you get one letter.
Yeah.
Okay, kids, step up to the plate. You get one swing. And I asked the rabbi afterwards, I said, this is a little bit going back to this Nazi Bible.
Yeah.
Because if the Nazis had won, that'd be the Bible.
Probably.
Right?
Yeah.
I asked that rabbi, I said, you don't know me very good. And I just got to write in this Torah.
Yeah.
Can anybody do that? And could they change it? Oh, did I get an ass whipping for that question? Because this brings up, a related idea, which is, is the Bible the revealed word of God? Did God write the Bible? I mean,
let's start with something else. Tanner, I take you as a Christian, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So this might be very interesting, especially to Christians, but all modern translations that we have today, right? They're based on the Masoretic text. The Masoretic text is around the 10th century, 11th century. And so for how many years so you're looking at like 1,000 years of the Masoretic text being the go-to original script, which was preserved all by Jews, right? And so there was a lot of speculation up to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls that maybe there's a fraud, maybe there's a forgery, maybe how can we rely? How can we know we can trust this translation? How do we know if any of this is true?
And then they found the Dead Sea Scrolls.
And then the Dead Sea Scrolls, which was, by the way, tied to the whole story of Israel coming back together, and the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls is an Indiana Jones material, basically. Seriously, it is.
No, I know what you're saying.
I don't know if you're familiar. But here's the thing, though. Just linguistically, if you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, over 90% of what was preserved for 1,000 years by Jewish rabbis in terms of the scripture itself, right? 1,000 years of preservation of that text, over 90% of it is identical to the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yeah. So my question is, though, where does King James tie into this? Because I know the Bible I have in my car right now, it's the King James version.
Yes.
So where does that
So
tie
he ordered, because King James, for political reasons, had to be the head of the church, right? The Anglican Church diverges from Rome and says, no, the king is going to be the head of the Anglican Church. So he had to have his own translation, right? And he really wanted his name in it too. That's why the book of James is named after him, by the way. I don't know if you knew that or not.
Okay.
Because in original language, James is Yaakov, right? So it has nothing to do with James, but they managed to translate Yaakov.
It's good to be king.
As, right. So he ordered the translation, and a lot of Jewish scholars are also part of that, by the way. So the origins of it basically was a commission by the king, right?
Right.
And it became kind of like the go-to from that point on, just because it was sanctioned by an and it's considered the authoritative translation from the original languages to English.
Yeah. So how can I be? I just get worried because he was the one that then picked out the order of the books and then like what books would be prevalent in it. So are there any missing books?
So you have books that are apocryphal, considered apocryphal, meaning outside of being necessarily divine, right?
So kind of like if we were talking about fictional stuff, the canon events.
The canon was determined much earlier. The canon, the canon formation goes back to the early church fathers and early centuries. That had nothing to do with King James. He took the books that are basically established as canon, and now the Catholic Bible does include what we consider apocrypha, historic books that are apocrypha. But the 39 books of the Old Testament, the 27 of the New Testament was something that he worked. It was already determined. He didn't pick and choose those books.
Okay.
you know.
But it does go into this conversation we're having about what people are reading. The real issue is, how do they read what they're reading? Let's just assume that there's a constancy,
Yeah.
and we're talking about this disagreement, and you're being very frank about it. You're saying it's okay with you. You're not looking for a fight with people.
No.
You're just saying from your perspective, that's not how you're reading the text. We talk a lot about on this podcast about street corners. There can be a lot of difference. There's 4 street corners. It's like if you're judging a boxing match, okay? If you watch an interaction from 2 different parts of the ring, they look completely different.
Yes.
What ends up happening, and I think what's dangerous, is that secret societies can capture the word in Hebrew, Jewish people, Christian people, they can capture it, and then they can use the word, use it, and there's great power in it. For example, we were talking about uh, healing. We were talking about, those attributes,
The
supernatural attributes.
Yeah.
Healing, supernatural healing, that is part and parcel with reading the text. A lot of people read that and they don't see that.
Exactly.
So I see that,
Right.
and I live it. So, but I could talk to somebody else and they go, man, you're crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We have to, the only way we can find, let's say, the unified Christian West is not to go after the Jewish question, so to say. This is a recipe for disaster, right? The core, and this is true for history as well. The core beliefs should be the Creator. If we believe in the Creator, if we believe in the divinely inspired Word of God, if we believe in, there's some just fundamentals. There's basic core
Redemption.
the redemption. Yeah, these are the important big ticket items that we call them, right? That are in the core of the faith. Those core beliefs are equally true for Christianity. For example, love your neighbor as yourself is not a Christian invention. This comes from Leviticus. This is not a Christian thing. This is a rabbi retelling the book of Leviticus. So why would I not have something in common with my Jewish brothers and sisters just because they disagree that Jesus is the fulfillment of the messianic prophecy? That's fine. They can disagree and they can seek in their own way. They can examine scriptures. We can argue about it. But at the end of the day, we're asking the same God to help guide us, to help with our moral condition, right? And you live in a hostile world. Again, I'm very much about what's the reality on the ground. You live in a world full of wars and desire for one group to extinguish another, right? To destroy another. So in this world, you got to make up your mind. Who are my allies? Who am I ally with ideologically, spiritually, philosophically, right? And if you miss that big picture, to me, it's just
That's a great point. That's a great point to let this be a springboard to your next visit. Because
Okay.
my question is, how do we unify the various factions in the so-called MAGA movement or the Republican Party? Because if we don't have unity, if we allow ourselves to continue to be fractured, the communists will win. And the communist globalists, and they know what they're doing, and they're all too willing to exacerbate these tensions. And now we're all on X or in digital, and we don't know where these posts are coming from and who's posting and what their intent is. So I'm seen by people in the Republican Party as being divisive, and that's because we don't agree.
yeah.
But that doesn't mean I don't like these people or want to break bread with them. Well, that's not true. I met a couple, but mostly the Republican people that don't agree with me, I like them as people. I'm not opposed to them personally. I don't take any of it personally. I'm looking for, and this is very helpful, what are the big ticket items
Exactly.
that can bring us together?
And you know what, David? It's like we just dropped a bomb on Iran, right? And we achieved better world peace. Peace through strength was just a great lesson. So great. However, uh, we do have existential issues here in the United States. You remember what happened with the riots around the George Floyd
Right
situation.
down the block.
Right, exactly. So we do have existential. We have on the inside now these a breeding ground. Every mosque, for example, is a military outpost, right? That indoctrinates The infidel is a dog. If you examine the Islamic ideology, I'm not talking about Muslims who are peaceful and they're doing,
What do they call reformed,
yeah,
so to speak?
there's no such thing as reform, but that's a whole different story.
But you know what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, no, I understand. People that are actually less into the Muslim ideology or religion, they're more peaceful. The deeper you get into it, the more
Jihad.
Jihadists. You become jihadists, right? So every mosque is a breeding ground for this militant ideology. When you take the militant left, which is a terrorist left, basically,
Which is now allied with that military.
allied, they've always been allied, right? We actually have existential issues. We need to
At home.
exactly. And so so again, what's the recipe? I don't have the recipe, of course, but I believe that the different MAGA movements, if you will, we need to agree that the number one concern here is preserving America, right? Preserving it as the republic that we believe in and that was given to us, that we see in the writings of the founders and the Federalist Papers and the Constitution, that historical, gift that's been given to us. We must fight for it here on our own turf, right? Because there's this whole internal destructive force now that's been unleashed. And that we really should be re-examining our whole stance in light of just a very basic existential threat.
And that's
concern.
what the whole podcast is about, getting people off the couch
Yep.
and into politics, politically active in the parties, so that a unity can develop around our Constitution, around our founding documents. Because why? Because it identifies a creator that granted us unalienable rights. And that is something that needs preservation.
Yes.
For sure. I'm going to have you back if you'll come.
Okay.
This
Well,
was
that'd be
great.
great.
Did you have a
Yeah.
good time, Tanner?
This was way better than, no offense. It's just sometimes talking about these kind of topics can get pretty boring.
Yeah.
This was amazing. I'm
Oh,
so
wow.
happy that you're here.
Wow, I
you
achieved-
answered my question
Because you were the
really
reason.
good.
I was like, hey, Tanner didn't get an answer to his question. So now I completed that part of the mission.
So we'll
That's
work on
great.
to we'll go on to number 2.
Well, there's more, David, and I really applaud you for being that open-minded. I wish our opponents were just as open-minded, which they're not. They're just a hardcore ideologue sometimes that, the whole cancel culture does not want these conversations, right? We must open an opportunity where all these perspectives must be looked at, right? And like I said, I haven't been persecuted by a government. I know what that feels like as well. Right. In Bulgaria, when I grew a church from 0 to 1,000, only to have the government shut me down. And for 7 years, I operated as a underground operation.
And let me just say, George, you're just a regular guy like me. In fact, George and I,
Yeah.
the last time we saw each other, we moved a friend from one house to another.
Exactly.
So we got up in the morning and we were lifting couches together.
Exactly.
And that's the last time that was a long time ago. My point is, all of the listeners and the viewers see the depth of George's study from his presentation. We're searching for truth here on this podcast. Freedom requires intent and scholarship and a continuous search for truth. And if we can come together as Republicans, and I don't mean the party, I mean as citizens of the Republic.
Conservatives, yeah.
Yeah, we have to search for these commonalities and unite around them and understand. And I'm going to leave with this. You talked about those bombs in Iran, and you said, but we have to really focus on our own as an existential threat here in the United States.
Yes.
We have to get our own, you can bleep this out, we got to get our own shit together and not continuously get drained militarily and financially, because how can anybody be defended if we can't defend ourselves?
I agree. Completely agree.
On that note, thank you for coming in.
Well, thanks for
Can
having
I have
me.
your commitment to come back?
Absolutely.
That was great. It was great having you.
Right.
Tanner,
Thanks, David.
thank you very much.
Of course. Thank you, George.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tanner.